Hello, everybody. I think we're live now.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Leena from the Missing Link Trust, and I would like to first of all welcome my whole panel out here, which is an amazing panel, which very unlike a trafficking World UN Trafficking Day panel, but I think it's going to be very, very different, and that's what's going to make it more special. Just to give you a little bit of a background about who we are and what we do, Missing started as a public art project in 2015, and I'm proud to say that now today it's actually an award-winning organization working with a single-minded focus on prevention of trafficking. And our work falls in primarily three pillars of innovation, education, and empowerment. And our vision is to create a world where every child is safe from trafficking. Today, as you might know, is the World's Day Against Trafficking in Persons, and to honor this amazing day, significant day, in the global campaign against trafficking, we are hosting a webinar, and which is titled "Awareness Equals to Prevention," which is the basic premise of the Missing Link Trust's why we run and what we do, and the key philosophy which drives us. Sex trafficking is a serious issue and a very grave reality and requires an interdisciplinary approach for the way forward. And to this end, we have today with us some very accomplished and inspiring people from the different fields and backgrounds for a holistic and an all-round understanding of what should our approach be to stop this exploitation. So I'm going to introduce the panelists today. Now, it's first I'm going to introduce Preeti to you all. Ms. Preeti Patkar is the co-founder and director of the organization Prerna that has done pioneering work in the red light districts of Mumbai. It works to protect children vulnerable to commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. Preeti opened her first childcare shelter more than 30 years ago, and she witnessed the cycle of exploitation that passed from one generation to the next in Mumbai. Prerna works towards breaking this cycle for the children to have equal opportunities and for them to assert their right to live a life free of stigma and violence. Then we have Dr. Patel here. Dr. Vibhuti Patel, formerly head of the Advanced Center of Women's Studies at Tata Institute of Sciences and the Department of Economics at the SNDT Women's University. Beyond being a distinguished academician, author of many books and research papers, she is also a social thinker and a mentor. Her focus has been on issues such as violence against women, women's rights to education, and feminist economics. It's very difficult to say such little about you, Dr. Patel, but I'm just sort of condensed it. Then we have, of course, Anshul here. Anshul Tiwari is the founder and editor-in-chief of Youth Ki Awaaz, which is the largest youth-based media platform in India. Youth Ki Awaaz is India's first platform to crowdsource opinions of the youth on their experiences and social problems. It has built an engaging and purposeful national conversation between citizens aimed at challenging the status quo and catalyzing the social change the youth want to see. Yeah, Anshul? Of course, last but not the least, we have Dr. Shruti Kapoor. She was named by Apolitical as one of the most influential people in the global policy in 2019. The same year, she was honored by the Indian Ministry of Women and Child Development as one of the 30 Web Wonder Women who have been driving social change via social media. Her organization, Safety, aims to promote rights-based awareness for women, and it also uses self-defense training, digital media, and storytelling to promote the unquestionable right of women to live their lives in safety. That's such a diverse group for everybody here, and I'm really looking forward to a really insightful conversation today. So I just want to take you all into the first basic premise of the first set of questions. So at Missing, we are primarily tackling the first P of the UN's 4P strategy against trafficking, and that is prevention. Our motto being, why wait for a girl to get trafficked to save her? So out of the 40.3 million documented victims of trafficking today, 30% comprise of young children, and with the majority of them being young girls. We at Missing have been dedicatedly working towards creating a new social fabric, and we have been developing a systematic awareness program for school students to sensitize them on the role they play in the rising trafficking figures. Our Missing Anti-Trafficking program has reached 135,000 students in urban and rural areas in a 2-year span. And recently, just before COVID, we actually held a national anti-trafficking awareness program just for specifically for Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. And within that framework, we actually had a very strong understanding of what about social media, how do they engage with it, and how do they, what are their preconceived ideas about trafficking, what is their role in it. And that particular reach was actually 7,500 in 9 states across India, and that just happened just before the lockdown. So, from what we've understood is we found that there are several different requirements and approaches that need to be addressed under the umbrella of awareness and how we can engage with the youth today. So, one of the major issues has been how to sensitize the population towards survivors. So, Preeti, my first question goes to you. It's 2020 now, and it's 30 years since you started Prerna. What did you envisage the world would be like in 2020 for your children? What do you think are the main hurdles that our first generation learners from the red light district still face? And what would you want from the society today?
Thanks, Lena, for inviting me. And a tough question, but I'm going to try. So, I definitely did not envisage 2020 to be what it is today. The pandemic, the lockdown, the stress, and to some extent, I can see the regression happening. And my biggest worry is that the children whom we had recently touched, we had recently started working. My fear is, and we are trying our best to ensure they do not fall through the cracks. And I think all of us in this development sector working on child rights are really doing that, ensuring how we can, keep the safety net for our children intact. Coming to your second question about the first generation survivors, the learners from the red light area, just before the lockdown I was speaking to this young man who was among the first who had completed his BSc IT. And part of his conversation, what did he say? And I want to share that with all of you. He said, my special background should not be my identity for too long. And this is what they want. It's not what I want. I think it's important for all of us to listen to them and see what they want. They want a society which will respect their privacy and confidentiality, which will not talk about things like courage and being coward just because you came out in the open, you decided not to disclose, none of that. At the same time, they desire a society in which they don't want to all the time hide their special background that they have. For them, they feel it should make no difference to anyone. And hence, there is no need to hide the identity vigilantly all the time. I keep using this word special background because I feel people should know that these are a group of children who fight every day a lot of odds. And I'm so happy to share here with you the 10th standard results which came out yesterday in Maharashtra. And all the children with whom we work, they cleared their board exams. I know we've, of late been talking about let's not talk about clearing board exams, pass and fail. But with this group, I think it's so important we mention it here because for them, this victory is this is a win against several odds, and it's important that we talk about it and we mention it here. I also feel that somewhere as a society, we should understand this whole concept of boundaries and the need to respect them. And when it comes to the children and youth with the background like the sex trade, the red light area, people very often, every time I interact with some section of people, even in 2020, I feel, they feel, oh, these group of children, this group of youth, do we really need to ask them, this whole element of giving them choice, the element to give them, this whole their right to have a space to voice their concern is constantly seen as, not necessary, not required, and not their right. People don't believe, like I said, in offering them these choices, and they don't feel the need to call them on the table to listen to them. Off late we talk about passing the mic. When it comes to these children, well, let them not have the mic. And additionally, I also feel that the youth that we work with, there are many who want to forget their past. They want to have a fresh start. And very often, the society just does not let them forget their past, does not let them have a fresh start. I feel, let's, like I said, listen to their voices, and let's also let's respect that they have a right to make choices and decide what is dignity for them, what dignity means for them, what they don't want. And again, I'm just telling you all that I keep hearing in all our meetings, in all our forums from these youth. They don't want to be pitied at all. They want, they're constantly looking for people who can empathize with them. They're looking for these safe spaces where people understand them, where nobody will judge them because where they were born, to whom they were born. They're looking for experiences of a life without stigma. They don't want to make red light area, born in the brothel, born to a victim of sex trafficking, born to a sex slave, born to a sex worker, their only identity. They would like to choose what their identity should be. They would like to choose if they want to disclose their identity or not. I remember a case of a 14-year-old girl, whom we had placed in a childcare institution. At the age of 14, she was very fond of a boy in her class. And this was labeled as a love affair. I was called, and in front of her, I was told, look, Preeti, sex runs in her blood. Instead of studying in school, look what she's doing. As if all of us went to school only to study. Anyway, similarly, once, we were about 4 years ago, there was this girl who was going to an interview for a job come training. And what is the condition she put? While she was discussing about going for this interview, she said, I will go for this interview only if I will not be considered because of my background. I'll be considered for what I am today. And if that is what is going to happen in that interview, only then I want to go there. So I think this is what people, whom we call the survivors of intergenerational trafficking, born in the brothels, want the society to understand of them, want the society to accept them without these labels, and not, divide the world into this good, bad, and ugly. And just because somebody came out in the open, say, look, wow, this is a hero, or he's courageous, which also means that those who chose not to come out in the open, you're saying they are cowards. This is not what they want. And all I'm doing is sharing all that I've constantly heard from the children, from the youth that I've worked with.
From what I can see, what you're saying is that um, don't feel so many years of the struggle in this space. My voice is echoing. There's still a curiosity with these people, which people are still not able to shed, and they still looked at some people, some like a whole generation or a whole species, which has to be looked at from under a microscope. Like people still have a very big curiosity towards them. What do they look like? How are they? And I think I'm sure that's going to be my thing for you. You have to keep that in mind. This sort of a conversation, I think, has to really come out in the open. That should really be something, because if people like Preeti are still struggling with that, I think there has to be more conversation in this front. So Shruti, my next conversation goes to you, because we're talking about a really big socio-cultural shift, right? We are working in fields and there are different agendas, and we're seeking to create awareness and effectualize our impact, but it's not possible without a bigger socio-political shift. So, when talking about culture and patriarchy, where do we situate the impact of internalized patriarchy in women itself in leading the violence against women? And how do we begin to unpack its psychological influence?
Lena, thank you for that question. I think it's really interesting that we're talking about it. So, I want to go back to the basics. I want to go back to what is internalized patriarchy or sexism. And I believe that it is the involuntary belief by women and girls that the lies, the stereotypes, the myths about women and girls that are delivered to them constantly in our society are true. And when we all hear of sexist messages about women in our lives, messages like women are weak, women are passive, women are manipulative, or that they do not have the intellectual capacity to be leaders. And a lifetime of such messaging has two consequences. One, the men and boys that grow up listening to these messages, they start believing in these messages, and as a result of that, they start treating women and girls accordingly. So they continue to protect their male privilege by colluding with the perpetuation of sexism. On the other hand, the same messages that are being meted out to women and girls, they eventually stick with them. And as a result, there is an internalized sexism and misogyny. Women and girls start acting these lies and stereotypes, doubting themselves and other females. It's also called horizontal hostility. When you have hostility towards other women, it's a result of this internalized patriarchy. And in this way, women are colluding with the perpetuation of sexism. So, we've seen many, many examples where women themselves are practicing harmful practices like female genital mutilation. Women play a huge role in terms of perpetuating menstrual myths. If you think about it, who is the one who's stopping you from entering the kitchen in your homes, or from going to the temples, or telling you what to touch or not to eat when you're menstruating? It's usually the elder women in our homes, right? It's usually our grandmothers, our mothers, who are perpetuating these myths related to menstruation. So if we don't challenge these internalized sexism, if we don't question these norms, it will lead to devastating consequences, which are manifesting in the form of violence against women. On the psychological side of things, it will ultimately lead to self-doubt, it will lead to self-hate, it will lead to self-censorship, doubts of mistrust and competition between women and girls. And as a result, women's collusion with sexism and male supremacy. So I think it is really upon us as individuals and as organizations who are working with women and girls to, one, recognize, then acknowledge and interpret or interrupt this internalized sexism. So what are some things? I'm really quickly
Yeah,
going to share some things that we can begin to do. One
sure.
is that we can begin to provide a framework and a common language for a genuine dialogue about sexism, internalized sexism, that can create an environment for encouraging such dialogues. We can identify concrete examples from our own lives about these internalized sexisms that women and girls have to live through. We can identify concrete examples of internalized sexism within institutional structures and programs. And then we can provide trainings through workshops to individuals to have a deeper understanding of their own awareness of this internalized sexism and internalized patriarchy that we have imbibed, for their commitment towards gender justice. So I think those are my thoughts on how we can really address this issue.
Created towards action. So if you do have any kit which you use, which you have, I'd love to be expose our ladies to it, because we do work with a lot of sensitive women, in the, especially we work a lot in Sundarbans. So we do have a whole community of women which you would love to engage with your conversation. So now I would like to go to Dr. Vibhuti Patel. When we spoke earlier, you mentioned that even if the families of the exploited abandon them, the government cannot, which was very interesting. What kind of role, according to you, the government play to provide to empower these vulnerable women and to draw them away from sex work and exploitation, away from the general thing which we all know, something more because you've done so much of a understanding of the space. For instance, when you also mentioning about the example of the state of Jharkhand, right? So I just thought if you could just tell us a little bit about your insight and how far has it gone and which have been the successful initiatives by the government and what can be done. Dr. Patel, you're mute. Yeah.
Even right from the days of partition, where Mrudula Sarabhai and Pushpaben Patel and Kamlaben Patel, who were managing the refugee camps in the border, Indo-Pak border and East Pakistan, India border and Kashmir border, all those women who were abandoned by their own families because they were raped. When these three women, for their heroic work, they were asked to take a ministerial birth. They had declined, and they said that if the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru respected their dedication, then the thing they should do, they should institute a Central Social Welfare Board. It is the duty of the state to look after these women to rebuild their life. So I think the same thing logic goes, and I think we also gender economics, when we talk about the gender responsive participatory budgeting, in that, because you must have seen over last 10 years, like since 2010, we see there is a budgetary allocation for this. Earlier, this item of trafficking of women and girls was not there. So that is one thing. Some of the state governments, where the issue of trafficking and lot of documentation and fact finding has done, they have also come up with, say, creation of a directory. Like Jharkhand, they have a directory in which all those who are leaving the city and their age, their village, name of the village, the profession that they do, and the destination that is there, and help desk is also created. So I think the same thing all state governments should do, and especially after this migration crisis we saw migration, we all focused only on the man as a migrant. Okay, only we women, when we saw the videos and pictures, we saw so many women were also migrating, because even among the migrant population 30% is women migrants. Okay, and as per the definition of labor force in our country, it is a 15 to 59. So that means so many 15-year-old girls are also working either in factory or as domestic workers and all, and so many times they become victim of trafficking. So it is very important to start help desk at the point, like at the railway station, at the bus station, and this help desk should not be just information giving. Okay, the trained people who can act more as a facilitator, who can provide this thing. Like I visited 3 night shelters run by Action Aid, Madam Sushila Prajapati is there, her organization in Delhi. And these night shelters have prevented so many cases of trafficking, because luckily for this young girl or an unknown person to the big city like Delhi, some gentleman or a caring woman, she just dropped them at the night shelter. So it's a very important that all urban centers also have a night shelter with a counselor and with a social worker. So that is the second very important thing. That so first is the gender budgeting for this thing. Second one is a creation of night center. Third is a creation of directory of the services. What kind of services can an unknown person to the unknown place can have? Whether services in terms of shelter, or in terms of job opportunities, in terms of any kind of violence they face, then where they can turn to that. No, if even if the employer doesn't pay the wages, or because trafficking takes place for 4 reasons. It's not only sex work, then cheap labor, because currently also we have seen, because of MG Narega, in the rural areas the wage rates have gone up. The adult worker will not be ready to accept below Narega wages. And what is the cheapest way of getting the labor is trafficking. So that is the second reason for trafficking. Third is a forced marriages, the areas in which there is a deficit of women. Okay, where the sex ratio is extremely adverse and so many men are unwed. So trafficking takes place. For example, tribal areas in Karnataka, tribal areas in Orissa, tribal areas in Bihar. From there, the girls are trafficked to the places like Haryana or Punjab or even western part of Gujarat, this thing. So that happens. So the third is that forced marriage. And the fourth reason is that of sex work. Okay, so these four are the major reasons for trafficking. And how can we solve this problem? How can we provide the support structures, institutional support? And in that, government should not doubt the intentions of NGOs, because wherever the government, like in Jharkhand or in border of India and Nepal, it is the brave act of the NGOs which has saved all these women. And then the government agencies and the NGOs work together. So it's a very important that the representatives of civil society, whether it is a civil society organization, non-government organization, or a community-based organization, their wisdom, their grassroots experience, their knowledge of the micro reality is respected by the government bodies. So administration also should work. And I think that happened in 95 when in Kamatipura, when all these child sex workers were, many of them refused to go back to their native place. If they were housed in 13 shelter homes in Mumbai city. And that time, women's groups, 10 women's groups, education for around 40 educational institutions, and Mumbai police, they worked under the whole umbrella of Operation Help. And College of Social Work has also done the documentation of this whole process so that frontline workers can get the idea of how can this collaboration result into rebuilding the lives of these women. And what Preeti said about that no mention of past sexual harassment, except for principle, nobody even knew that where the girls were coming from these shelter homes. No, so that kind of environment. And many of them I meet now also, who are either working with the NGOs or who are working in the factories, and so many of them have are leading the lives like your and my daughter. So I think it is possible that it is not that you have to end your life only in misery, but when there is a supportive hands and the collaborative efforts, the lives can be changed. Yeah.
Like you're saying, there's so much which has already been done, but yet there is so much still left to do, and we still find so many hurdles. And in this day and age, you really don't expect. I mean, when the private enterprises have been able to smoothline their whole chains, and when everything else has managed it so well, why are we still struggling with some basic connections in this place, which we are all facing, like especially in the trafficking space? It's very difficult to join the dots yet. So we still hope that happens, but people like Anshul are doing crazy good work here. So Anshul, talking about within the socio-cultural ambit, your work has redefined the significance of collaborative efforts of citizen-driven campaigns in the wake of the social media revolution. How would you assess the impact of these online campaigns and the role they play in the positive action today in the way forward India is moving forward? Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Leena. And, it's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to listen to all the experts on the panel. Of course, there's a lot to do and a lot to share. But to your question specifically, Leena, I think, if we go 12 years back, I started Youth Hears about 12 years back when I was 17. And from then till now, the landscape has changed tremendously. At that time, nobody took social media for social change or for anything for that matter as seriously as people do right now. It's become one of the main platforms or spaces that people are using to speak up, to really create a solid voice for themselves, for the issues that they represent, and for those things that really matter to them. So, in a scenario like that, if you just look back at the last decade or so, just simply for movement building, I think social media has played a very, very big role, in mainstreaming dialogues and conversations that were earlier happening in, hushed environments. People were not openly talking about it. If we see just on Youth Ki Awaaz, for instance, a couple of years ago, in fact, about 1.5, 2 years ago, Youth Ki Awaaz ran a campaign along with Change.org on trafficking and, on child trafficking. And that was one of the biggest campaigns that we had seen on social media. Two fairly large social media outfits coming together to demand change on ground, for an issue that really matters to all of us. And we saw for the very first time, Leena, that, people who had always just heard of these issues were, obviously because of their privilege, their access to the fact that the mainstream media is not talking about these issues. Because of all of these reasons, they had just barely heard of these issues. But for the very first time, as both the platforms went mainstream with a lot of these stories, we saw how young people really came together and they started demanding action, policy level action, at a national level, but also at a regional level. And we saw these communities building up in places like Lucknow and various other places that we had actually gone and done a lot of our campaigning. So I feel in the last decade or so, online campaigning has played a very, very big role in impacting directly the way we talk about issues. Now, if you look at beyond YK as well, there are, recent movements like the Me Too movement, for example. It has definitely accelerated the conversation around, sexual harassment that women have to go through. There have been various other movements that have really built up over the last couple of years, which have accelerated the work that's already happening on ground. And I have to point out something extremely critical about social media here, Lina, which is that the way I see it, any campaign online or any campaign on digital on the digital landscape does not work as effectively as it could or as it would if it had the backing of offline activism as well, of on ground activism as well. Some of the most impactful campaigns around us, if you look at how worker rights have been demanded for in places like Kodaikanal, with big corporations like Unilever, it's really been the building up of an on-ground movement that got accelerated by an online movement that led to that. So, I would actually say and really strongly say that, in fact, to some of the points that other panelists also raised, that, there are these stories that are still not out there. And I feel like, people who are working on ground, who are seeing these things firsthand, I think we can play a really big role in changing the narrative. And in fact, more than changing, in developing a new narrative, using social media very effectively as well.
Thanks, Anshul. I was there, in fact, part of the Change.org Youth Ki Awaaz campaign. It was great. Yeah. We did a mural and we did a chatbot with it. And talking about the power of social media, that's how we started. So I was an artist with a public art project at the India Art Fair. And when I was waiting for this public-private partnership to happen, and I just waited for months, and then I said, if I really want to say something, what's stopping me? And I actually immediately just started my campaign on my computer, and I started building my community. And I rolled out the first crowdfunding, which we did for the missing campaign in 2015. That time, crowdfunding was still very nascent. But I totally agreed. I mean, I said, if I want to talk to the public, what's stopping me starting now? And the power is there. I'm totally with you. There's lots which we can do in that space, and you are doing it. So culture is what brings all these people together, and simultaneously, culture is what also excludes people, right? And acts as a barrier. So, Preeti, do you think today's culture, with all its attempts for inclusivity, whether it's successful or not, is reaching the survivors and their families as compared to other marginalized communities? Preeti, you're mute.
Okay. No, I'm not. Can you all hear me? I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Great. So, for me, my journey has been for last 33 years, and I definitely have seen a lot of positive change as compared to when I started work. I definitely see the culture of inclusion. So first and foremost, let me just, acknowledge all those amazing people, individuals, organizations who, in the true sense, I find have embraced the practice of inclusivity. Okay. While working with victims, with the survivors and their families. But I must say, even after 33 years, this is a small number, far and few between. I'll just give you an example. Last year, I had this, I call her a very enthusiastic, resourceful youth, very passionate. I just can't tell you, I think for over about 4 months, she tried convincing me on how important it was to start a school just for children of sex workers. And for me, it was an Herculean task trying to convince her that this is not the approach Prerna has. This is not the approach I have had. This is not the approach we should have. This will only result in further isolating this community. For me, this approach is against mainstreaming. And for me, when I have worked with this community, with other communities, I feel, mainstreaming is what we should all aim for. I still find people who think sex trade and women in sex trade are a necessary social evil. Yes, we are in 2020, and this is what people think about the sex trade and women in the sex trade. They want the sex trade, they want prostitutes, they want sex workers, but all to be kept in the backyard. They want to work with this group, they want to work, they do work, but some of them want to work using a barge pole. Their suggestions are always to create separate programs for them. Have something exclusive for them. That's what I keep hearing all the time. So when it comes to, safety spaces for these children, for the children born in the red light area, their suggestion is let's have exclusive childcare institutions for them. For children, and recently, and I'm sure Dr. Shruti here will like to hear this, we also run a shelter facility for girls in need of care and protection and work with a lot of childcare institutions with different stakeholders. And you know what I keep hearing? Let's have separate facilities for these young adolescents who are victims of sexual assault. Separate for rescued girls, separate for children born to prostituted women. We still see this mindset that you need separate for them. Let's have something exclusive for them because they consider this group as a bad influence for others. And it is part of our culture, unfortunately, even today, where anything to do with sex is defined as good, bad, and also ugly. We put them in these categories, in these boxes. Inclusivity based on rights is very scarce. For me, I rarely experience it. Whereas I also see sometimes, there is inclusion, but it is in some form of an opportunism veiled behind charity. I'll give you an example. Recently, now with the lockdown and COVID, I call him a well-meaning person, approaches me and says, I read in the newspaper, women in the sex trade in Kamatipura since the lockdown have no dhanda, they have no income, they are indebted. I would like to rehabilitate them. So now listen to this, okay? Now I have my concerns for all that he said. I know he's a well-meaning person, but this is what well-meaning is in our society. So he says, let's train these women as bedside assistants in hospitals for COVID patients and reserve all the seats exclusively for them. Preeti, please handpick the good and hardworking ones. This is how they feel is inclusion into mainstream society. And believe me, it is difficult for me to accept that this is inclusion. I remember our entire, there was this major movement in Maharashtra with the closure on dance bars. And there were many people who were advocating for alternatives for them. And each one was advocating, and the major voice was, okay, let's put them on jobs of road construction in stone quarries. This is what we feel should be, made available for these women. Now let's come to the women. Let's listen to the voices of the women. What do women think? Do they feel included? Absolutely no. Even today, and today if you go on our Twitter chat, on our social media, you will hear voices of women on what they think rehabilitation should be. And believe me, every woman had something different to say about what rehabilitation means for her. And women actually ask us, even if we do decide to leave the sex trade, would people let us live in peace? Will we be accepted once when people get to know that we are in the sex trade? We've had women who've told us, the day I leave the sex trade, if you see me, if you meet me, and this is not women, it happens even with children. There are some children who come to us in our exit meeting and tell us it is our choice. It's unfortunate, but do not follow up on us if we don't come back. If you meet us, I remember a youth who told me, if you meet me somewhere, please don't start, don't get excited and greet me, and don't say Kamati Pura and Prerna, because the world knows what Kamati Pura is. And the minute you say Prerna, people will immediately associate, my life with the sex trade. So please don't say that. And we've heard this several times. Even with the children, like I said, when they can experience it when they are in schools, they can experience it when they are in college, they can experience the stigma associated with this sex trade, they experience the so judgmental statements their peers make every time there's discussion around sex trade. They know and they've experienced what it means to be associated with names like Kamatipura, Budhwarpet, GB Road, and to add to it, there is stigma associated with HIV. We need to have a frame of mind that truly believes in integration and not segregation, not isolation, not exclusion. So Dr. Vibhuti Patel was talking about the 1996 raids. And let me tell you, one of the major outcomes of the 1996 raid was the High Court passing an order to set up an exclusive home for minor victims. Why? Why can't we mainstream them? Why do you, not trust your socialization? Why do you think a handful of children from the red light area can spoil the good children in your shelter home? Why is it that you don't believe that your strong socialization will influence these children, if at all you were to believe that these are bad children? I don't believe in it. But, so long as this mindset does not change, year after year, we'll keep having these proposals. Let's have something exclusive for them. And here again, I want to differentiate. I know there are some people who say it very well-meaningly because they feel, if you do it inclusive, there is stigma, so let's do it exclusive. But I think moving forward, that is not the way. Moving forward, the way is integration, no to segregation, no to isolation, no to exclusion. And once again, I want to appreciate and salute all those who have embraced inclusion in the true sense, because we need more people like them, and these are the people who will set the example moving forward.
Thank you, Preeti. I mean, we can see the struggle you're facing in the rehab space. I mean, this is such a diverse topic because we heard all that there, and there's so much we want to do in prevention and the policy. Just coming back to Dr. Patel, and I mean, this is such a big topic that we're jumping a little bit here, but I think it's all about what we can grasp about the space at from every section. Dr. Patel, how does the feminization of poverty contribute to the cycle of sex trafficking?
Yeah.
Which in ways
before that, I want to make one factual correction that in the educational institution, whichever colleges and schools they went to, these girls from this particular institution, there was no segregation. No teacher. I can personally vouch because I am a teacher and I was also involved in a one-to-one counseling, though I was a totally unsuccessful because I looked like a Kotewali, middle-aged, fat woman. So girls did not trust me. That's a different issue. My daughter was more effective. It was in peer counseling. But in the educational institution, there was no segregation. They were like any other students. And they were.
We'd be happy to hear that. Right.
That is one. Now coming to my question of feminization of poverty, I think the whole the neoliberal logic and the macroeconomic policies, whether it is in urban area, 94% of women in the workforce, according to ILO, are in informal sector. And we know informal sector, there is a law of jungle. Deliberately, the wages are kept low. Even if you see the Naka workers, if you see in every public place or at the railway station, the women also stand there as Naka workers. They want to work in the construction industry or this. Everywhere there is a Jodi system. So man is treated as a worker. He is a face and name. Woman is a faceless. She will be waiting and waiting and waiting, and they would not give her work. She has gone there to ask for work. But what they would say, Atikya, that means you want to have a sex or not. And though they are in the work, and even when they are working, they are deliberately given 1/3 or 1/4 of the wages of the man. And then when she asks for her due, then they would demand sex work. So that is another thing. Arjun Sen Gupta committee report on the unorganized sectors workers, that also showed that among the unorganized sector workers, 60% of the women are managing their households with 20 rupees per day. So imagine in today's time, how do you manage your this thing and a 20 rupees per day? When it comes to the rural area, same thing in rural area, even under MG Narega, that means even when the government is employer, the contractors, they subvert the system. Women get 1/3 of the men's wages in so many sectors, whether in the sugarcane industry, largest supplier of sugar Maharashtra is, and there also you have a Jodi system. So unless you have a male partner, you can't get job. So even in that, there will be differential wages, and obviously when there is a below subsistence wages, women will be under tremendous pressure. Third, this thing in a tribal area, the whole forest laws, which criminalizes and brutalizes tribal population, all the mega projects are coming up in that area. People are completely dispossessed of their livelihood. So everywhere, in each and every sector of the economy, urban informal sector, because the large number of these things are MSMEs, micro, medium, and small industries. None of them are applying any labor laws. Under the lockdown, we have seen 12 states have already abandoned 48 labor laws, which the Indian working class movement won after 150 years of collective struggle. So that is gone. And now instead they have brought labor code, which has enhanced even further vulnerability of women. So in agrarian sector, in the tribal areas, and in the urban sector, everywhere women are facing tremendous this thing. And when the Me Too movement happened, where articulate, urbane, highly educated women started speaking, even women in the informal sector also shared all their horror stories at the workplace. Okay, domestic workers, massive. Like I just live in front of St. Catherine's Home. Okay, and I was a volunteer for 10 years for that institution. All these unwed mothers ward, whose was that? Most of them were domestic workers in the Andheri western suburbs of Mumbai. The employers would come, dump this pregnant woman, and once the delivery is over, she's taken back. So even at the workplace, she's being sexually exploited, no? And these things are not recorded, except for the union, nobody would know about it. And once these are unmarried young girls, if they are exploited, then sexually exploited, no one would marry them. So matter is hushed up at that level. So I think feminization of poverty increases vulnerability, not only for sex work, but also the whole organ trafficking that is happening. So many girls in the farm area, because of the distress in agriculture and the volatility in the agrarian prices, so many farmers, men are committing suicide, but so many women, like say in Gujarat, men are not committing suicide, but women are surrendering their bodies for surrogacy or for the organ trafficking. It is happening in a big way. So I think feminization of poverty is a major reason for all types of vulnerabilities. We have heard in a public hearing on women and health, we heard from the very remote areas of Maharashtra, where first of all these predatory financial institution, microfinance, private microfinance institution, they would be after poor women for them to take a loan for small business. Within a week, these loan sharks, they would come and they would just start demanding interest. How can a poor woman who has just taken the loan just get any profit? And then they would traffic them and they would take away. In the public hearing, they also showed the cut on their this thing, that how their kidney was taken away, how one woman was kidnapped from her village and taken to a nearby tier 2 city to further sex trade, to repay the loan. So I think in a variety of ways, vulnerabilities of women are being cashed on and capitalized by the vested interest.
That's a really different, it's a very, very in-depth, actually a small glimpse into a really big issue about how it's actually shrouded by patriarchy. It's about coercion. It's about your own family telling you to do things. And it's about, feminine,
So patriarchal
exploitation.
control over women's sexuality, fertility, and labor is complete. With surrogacy, that has also come. So all
It's
three
complete.
are complete.
And it's more of coercion, and people don't win. They think they're doing it for themselves or their family, and everyone's feeling they're doing it for their own family, but they're getting
Correct,
totally exploited.
correct, correct.
Shruti, it's a very, very different angle I'm taking you to. I know. I mean, I'm really feeling as if I'm jumping out here, but it's so many different sections of this discussion which is going on here. It's about, I'm taking you back to suppose the urban space, and we're talking about more exploitation here. But it's also talking about sensitizing the future generations. Because though I know we're talking about the struggles which Preeti is facing, then we're talking about future policies. But you and Anshul coming forward for me is about what's the hope and what can we do for the future and for what kind of a future are we shaping. So suppose when I ask you, how do we sensitize these future generations to understand consent as just not just sexual but also respecting emotional and personal boundaries? And how is the lack of understanding of consent is the first step of abuse, which I'm sure you know well.
Wow. Consent culture, I think it's a really hot favorite topic of mine. I think I
Okay.
want to go back to the fact that it's a huge myth that consent is only important when it comes to sex, right?
Yeah.
We create consent culture when we value the feelings and emotions of the people that we are interacting with, either casually or professionally. So it's really all about respecting personal and emotional boundaries every single time. I usually use this to remind myself consent can be voluntary, consent should be voluntary, enthusiastic, sober, verbal, non coerced, continuous, and honest. So, in the sexual context, a lack of consent really resorts to rape, right? That's what rape is. And only when consent has been vocalized should we take the relationship to the next level. And it's because it's really at the end of the day, it's about mutual satisfaction and not just about focusing on yourself. So, in our daily lives, there are plenty of non sex related ways in which we can model the concept of consent to our children and to adults also. So for example, I'm a parent, and when a relative wants to hug my child and my child feels uncomfortable or doesn't want to hug back my relative, I think it is okay for us as parents to teach our children that they can politely refuse to hug anybody they don't want to hug, right? That's teaching them consent culture. Before posting your child's photos or before posting anybody's photos, your friends' photos, do you take permission from your friends, before putting them on social media, on Facebook? And if they say no, are you okay with that no? Do you force your children to eat things they don't want to or go to places where they don't want to? I think inculcating and asking children and asking our friends and our families for permissions on these day-to-day things really helps us build in that consent culture. Teaching boys and girls very early on to respect their bodies goes a long way in building consent culture and eventually addressing the root cause of gender based violence. So let's come back to sex talk. I think Preeti mentioned that anything when it comes to sex, when we start talking about sex, it's the good, the ugly, or the bad, and we compartmentalize these. And even today, in this century, sex talks are awkward. Most parents don't know how to have these sex talks with children. Most children want to ignore or avoid it. But how can we have any talk about consent without having sex talks? So I think it is really upon us as a society to have a very, very comprehensive sex education at homes and schools. I believe it's in a large number of homes, it's completely missing having the sex talks. It's completely missing. It's still a taboo and a shameful topic to talk about. Parents don't know how to address this. Educational institutions and media can play a very, very pivotal role in opening up spaces and creating safe spaces for parents to promote and have these conversations on topics they still consider taboo. So I want to take the example of Norway because they have done an excellent job in teaching their children from a very, very young age. They're providing them sex education. They're talking about private parts of the body. They're talking about what is a safe versus an unsafe touch. And they're using humor to have these conversations. And I think it is from these examples and examples like these that we can learn, in our society, on how to have these conversations a little bit more comfortably and more openly. And I think as adults, if we still find it hard to have these conversations on sex, on culture, then it is upon us to really examine our own shame baggage about sex and try to get rid of it before we pass it on to our children. Let's come to dating life. When it comes to consent culture, I think dating life will also become healthier and more regular when consent culture becomes a norm in our society. So, for example, if a girl refuses to go on a date, people won't think it's okay to keep asking her out again and again, right? A no will be considered a no, and it won't be considered as she is trying hard to get, which is what often our media and our movies are constantly perpetuating. In fact, we will finally be able to put an end to this try harder mentality, which only leads to continuous harassment, which also leads to stalking in many, many cases. So I think it is really upon us as a society to start inculcating consent culture in our day-to-day lives. Boys will stop taking advantage of drunk girls and they, let them sleep. Girls will learn earlier how to fulfill their sex desires, and not feel ashamed or guilty about having a boyfriend, or about having relationships, or about having sex, or being in pain, doubt, or shame. And I think overall it's a win-win situation if we are able to successfully inculcate consent culture. Even young people will find it mutually satisfying in terms of their relationships. So growing up in the 70s and the 80s, this concept of consent culture was completely missing from my life, and I'm sure from a lot of our lives. Our parents never asked us really for consent, right? We were told what to do. And I think it's high time now that at homes, in educational institutions, that we start building consent culture, because it should be a huge part of our society, honestly.
Totally, Shruti. Talking about the power of narratives, like Anshul, you probably, Youth Ki Awaaz has seen many stories on this line, right? Consent and personal stories of individuals and how they're opening up nowadays, and how these personal stories, how have you seen it influence this fight for equality and justice in this space? Would you just shed some light about how this affects, the overarching narrative? How much of change are you seeing in the space of the consent
Right.
culture? Yep.
Right. No, thank you so much for that question, Lena. I think it's super important to talk about the power of narratives, because I feel a lot of the stereotypes and taboos that exist around us, they exist because it's been perpetuated by a certain kind of a very convenient patriarchal narrative that's existed always, pretty much always, and it's kind of subjected, those who are bearing the brunt of these issues for generations now. And I think the only way to kind of break that intergenerational violence, not the only way, but definitely one of the most effective ways of breaking that intergenerational violence that's been going on, is to actually challenge that narrative with the counter narrative. We talk about it when we think of politics. We talk about it when we think of other forms of violence. We talk about it, all across the board. But we need to bring this counter narrative culture to the social issues that we're also working on. So I feel like the biggest impact that personal stories and personal narratives, or narratives in general, can have is that they can really challenge the norm in a very, very big way. So, if I talk about it from my experience, having seen more than 100,000 people share their personal stories, and personal, extremely deep stories of having gone through violence, dealing with struggle, dealing with challenges, around their bodies, their identities, and so on and so forth. One thing that has definitely happened is that a solidarity community has built around these individuals or these issues. And I think, while the first step, of course, is the first outcome, clear outcome is that solidarity communities really build up. The second, much bigger outcome ends up being that when there is a need to demand policy action, or when there's a need to demand system change, these communities of solidarity actually come together, and they become one unit, and they're able to demand this in a much louder voice as well. So I feel like narratives can really play a very big role in changing the way we think about so many of these issues. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of some of the campaigns that we've seen on our own. In fact, the one that you were yourself a part of, Forum for Change, there were survivors of trafficking who themselves had published stories anonymously on the UK Awaaz platform, and we saw that for the very first time there were people who were accessing information that wasn't easily available to them about the challenges and about the stereotypes that they have to really deal with. There was an instant connection and a building of an empathy kind of a scenario that really occurred for that campaign. Similarly, with other partner organizations, like for instance with WaterAid, we had been talking about manual scavenging for a very long time, and female manual scavengers in particular. And one story of a freed manual scavenger, and how she spoke about the fact that their identities are so deeply connected to the profession, that even if they break out of it and try and get new jobs, it becomes terribly difficult for them to actually go ahead and lead that life. That one narrative, Lena, started a massive conversation online, about it. It actually led to many more campaigns launching off from there. Similarly, in the space of menstrual hygiene, in the space of sustainable development goals, so many others. I feel like narratives can play a very big role in creating an inclusive dialogue, because I feel, when we have the right platforms, when we have the right spaces, when we agree to pass the mic, it becomes extremely important that we make sure that as many of these stories and narratives are coming out, because they can really lead to a generational shift, for a lot of these, these issues as well. So generally, I feel that like I was saying in my previous answer as well, that there are so many phenomenal organizations that are working on this issue, that have been working on this issue for a very, very long time. I feel with their knowledge, with their expertise, with their hold of the language, and with availability of open platforms, it can be really, these narratives can really be amplified to a point where there can be communities that can be built around these issues, which go way beyond just the organizations themselves that are working, on these issues. Citizen institutions can play a very, very big role in really coming together and powering through these issues. So I feel that that's the shift that these narratives can really bring about.
That's totally there. In fact, that's why I'm feeling there should be so many more. In fact, I hope you multiply, and I totally believe in what you're out about, what you're doing, right? Because you're actually the underlying thing which can help so many people in the change space who want to really drive a change, because um, you have the power to really create a deeper change in the next gen, from your platform. So I want to just go back into a little bit of again, take you into what the trust has done. So our main USP has been to use innovative mediums to engage the population on the issue of sex trafficking, which I've been saying. And we started it with an award-winning Game for Change in 2016. And since then, we've added Neural with chatbots. We've added interactive digital comics. We've added a Guerrilla art campaign. And all these are very easy to use by the youth. And it's being done by students across the world. In fact, I've had people across the world who made the stencil in their rooms, in their walls, to show their solidarity with the missing girls. So our agenda under this pillar has broadened its focus to social innovations in this evolving digital scape, and especially relevant now because in India we are scheduled to have, I think, 800 million smartphone users by 2021. And that gives us the opportunity to really reach this huge population right in their hands, right? And I mean, we don't have to, we just, we will reach right into their hands. The most powerful space for us to talk to this people, which you and Shruti especially are really using. So talking about this growing significance of digital technology and the internet, I'd like to direct my next question to Shruti. Shruti, it's a very important space for mobilization of women to share their experiences, and campaigns like gender-based injustices like Me Too and all have seen their whole, it's started and it's reached its end, and it's really been something which has been successful. But we have also seen a downside where synergies have faded. Like we saw the whole Bring Back Our Girls campaign with the Boko Haram, and which is so sad because those girls disappeared, and then nobody remembered them.
Shocking. Yeah.
After 3 months or after 6 months, nobody was talking about them. So, what would you say would be key to harnessing that really urgent requirement for change? And let's hope that important things don't fade away in the social landscape.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Lena. So I feel that social media campaigns are like wildfire, they
Yeah.
spread like wildfire, but they also burn out very, very fast. Movement building is a process oriented, it is relational, and it is iterative. And so there are a number of patterns that one sees between a successful campaign and a not so successful campaign. And I quickly want to just highlight those. So, a successful campaign or a movement usually focuses on grassroots. They recognize the importance of state and local efforts. They also commit to changing the norms and attitudes along with the policy. So the focus is not only on changing policy, but it's also about changing social norms. There is a willingness to work with adversary allies. And then there is, of course, the acceptance that businesses can also be key allies in that movement building or in that campaign. And finally, it's all about the leaderful. What is leaderful? Leaderful is, almost a term that was inspired by a civil rights activist called Ella Baker. So usually successful social change leaders, what they do is they recognize the importance of advocating for social change and shifting social norms, and not just policy. And they don't give one, they never prioritize one over the other. So, for example, in the US there was a movement for marriage equality, and what the LGBTQ activists did very quickly, they used polling research and they very quickly reframed the narrative and the focus of the campaign from messaging from rights to things like love and commitment. And what that really did was it led to a dissemination of slogans like love is love, right? So now,
Right.
instead of just focusing on, hey, let's have change in marriage laws, they also started focusing on changing social norms and the way people, look at equal marriages. And that was hugely successful in the US. So also, I feel a social movement is only as effective as its leaders. So the most effective leaders are the ones who are willing to share power, and lead from behind the campaign and behind the movement. They actually harness the energy of many other grassroots leaders. They bring them together and they allow them to share their personal narratives and their experiences related to the movement, and the campaign. So one of the primary reasons why I think, some viral campaigns are short-lived is because they mainly leverage on the extrinsic incentive to do good rather than the intrinsic motivation to help others. So, for example, a lot of the movements, a lot of the challenges that we see going viral today, there is an extrinsic incentive for us to win the challenge. And we are led by the motivation to win the challenge rather than to do good. And it has been shown by research that when you are driven by the external, motivation to win a challenge rather than your intrinsic motivation to do good, the movement or the reason why you're doing anything is very short-lived. It's as short-lived as the social campaign itself. And that's why we see, a lot of campaigns going viral very quickly, but then they die out over time because they have not tapped into the inherent motivation to really do good and care for the cause. It's all about winning a challenge. So I think, those are my 2 cents on why certain movements, certain campaigns live longer and are more successful compared to others, which might go viral, but then, they disappear in space.
So you think the Boko Haram thing was actually mainly against that particular community who'd kidnapped those girls? It was not about the larger picture about. Okay, okay, great. I mean,
At
that's a
some
great.
point, it became about, holding that hashtag in front of you and
Right.
taking a picture, right? That's what it all became.
Yeah.
Bring back those girls, but nobody was really addressing the larger cause and the larger issues related, to that whole problem.
Right. Great, Shruti. That's lovely.
Thank you.
Anshul, this again to you. What do you think exposes and news reports like the one about, remember the one which you shared at the WSA about the Nepali woman? I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. About, how can exposes like that trigger immediate legislative changes? I mean, that's such a powerful way of doing it, right? And also
Yeah.
give us some insights on the growth and engagement of, I know it's two-sided. I'm also talking about how are you leveraging and going into rural India? I know it's a two-part question. Yeah.
Right. No, thank you so much for that, Lena. Just for the listeners who are not aware of the story is by an award-winning journalist Soma Basu, who brought this story to Youth Ki Awaaz in 2015. And the story, when I personally first read it, I was of course completely shocked and taken aback at at how gruesome this act of violence was. And the story was about how young women from Nepal, a particular village in Nepal, are trafficked to Bombay, and their skin tissue is extracted from the back to fuel the illegal plastic surgery industry in India. Because in India we have a fair skin obsession, and that was really the reason behind this whole scam that was going on for a very, very long time. The way Soma had discovered this was that she was on she was actually holidaying in Nepal. She went to a massage parlor, and she noticed that one of the masseuse over there, she had this big scar on her back, and that piqued her curiosity. And that really led to the whole story. I think when we first received the story, when I first read the story, of course, it was extremely shocking, and we weren't sure how to really position this, because nothing on skin trafficking had ever been said online, or even like anywhere else. We looked up everywhere. There was no mention of skin trafficking as a word, as a phrase, or this particular village or this particular set of instances per se. We double checked, triple checked the sources. When we got confidence on the story, along with Soma, we published it on YK. And the first thing that happened, Lena, was that within the first 4 to 5 days, there were close to 500,000 people who had read that story. And the reason why that happened was because this was the very first time that a narrative like this had come out, which was happening right in front of the people living in Bombay, and so on. And yet nobody knew about it. And it begged the question that how could this have escaped the eyes of the decision makers around us? And I think that really got the attention. It got read by a very, very large number of people within the first week or so. And while there were other aspects of the story, like for example, Soma got several journalistic awards, blah blah blah, but the story was not really about that. What it really led to was that the very first time it made the Nepal government publicly accountable, and it held them accountable towards what was happening, and they had to come out in public and actually say that we are investigating this matter, and we're going to make sure that we put an end to this. We heard from the UNHCR. We heard from various other agencies asking us to provide sources, do this, do that. Thomson Reuters actually conducted an independent fact checking on this story, and they even awarded Soma with this with their highest journalism honor. And yet we kind of realized that when you talk about an issue like trafficking, it's not just the one narrative from Nepal that can change the whole landscape. It can trigger the conversation. It can make the government sit up and pay attention. It can make people really angry, and it can make them demand action. But like we just spoke about Boko Haram, right? We need consistent demand for action to really be able to bring about change. So what that particular narrative did, Lena, was that it really brought forward an issue that was not being talked about earlier. Now it's publicly acknowledged. It's going in. A lot of organizations are putting a considerable amount of their work into it. Many of these, people who were involved in it, who were trafficking these young girls, they've been caught. They've been, put behind bars, and so on. But of course, a lot more is there that needs to be done. But I think what these kind of stories really do, these kind of narratives really do, is they jolt you out of your comfort zone, and they make you realize, they make you get up and pay attention to the fact that there is more that needs to be done, and we need to be demanding for change right now. So I think that's really the impact of such narratives. And to answer your second question, Lena, on the rural India aspect, it's a I don't know, like it's 2020. We shouldn't even be talking about this as much, but it's a big myth that the internet penetration is not reaching places. It is actually reaching places a lot faster than we can imagine. I know the app has been banned, but I'll just take one more minute. But TikTok, for instance, came in as a platform that really empowered the voices of so many young people from geographies that Instagram, Facebook, all of the other social media just did not create space for. And a very elite idea of content. So I feel just a cursory look at that app while you could have looked at it would have given you an idea of how deeply penetrated internet in India actually is. And even when we conduct our online surveys, you'll be surprised to know that people from districts that are actually some of the most marginalized, economically backward districts are actually filling out surveys because they believe that going online, filling out surveys, creating and having a voice can actually lead to something. So I feel that of course everybody's not covered, but it's happening. And we need to now start making strategies to really reach out to people who are now for the very first time joining the internet, because we can really deliver powerful information, content, stories to them and change the narrative from there. And that's the audience we should be tapping into.
So you have, I mean, how much percentage of your audience must be regional?
So, for us, close to 40, 45%, 40%, I would say would be regional. In fact, mostly because of our Hindi content, from the time we launched our Hindi content, of course, the top tier cities are dominating our, readers, our readership. But there's a considerable amount of young people who are visiting Youth Ki Awaaz from, tier 2, tier 3 cities, tier 4 cities, peri-urban areas, who are even making videos and sending and so on. And they're really, speaking out very actively. Just yesterday, we had a Facebook Live, and we had a very active farmers community from Bundelkhand that was watching that live. And they were asking questions as well. So I feel like, there are various things that can be done to really reach out to a lot more people than our.
And I totally agree with you. Like, we work in Sundarbans, which is like with a very tip near Bay of Bengal, and our unit out there has high speed internet. So for me, there's nothing which is rural and urban, and we totally understand. I mean, it's everywhere, right? In net connectivity today. So the biggest challenges which we are facing in the work we do is, of course, counter-trafficking measures and the lack of reliable data in the governing. I'm going back to trafficking from the social media. A lack of reliable data from governing bodies like the NCRB data and the others, which actually there's a very big clash, right? The child line will have its own numbers, NCRB will have its own numbers, NGOs will have its own numbers. Going back to the really basic of the problem of anti-trafficking. Vibhuti, why don't you tell us what are the biggest challenges when researching an issue as complex as sex trafficking? How can organizations like ours drive research initiatives to address the lack of reliable data in sex trafficking?
Yeah, I think the major problem that comes is the question of morality, because the economists go by the sectors of the economy and how you define work. Because anything related to sex immediately brings the question of morality, and they would not gender disaggregated data when we ask for. So they would give that whether it is a agrarian sector or industrial sector or service sector or hospitality. Casino will come under hospitality sector, but when it comes to anything sex trafficking, they would see it as a parallel economy or underground economy or something with a crime, or compare them with either illicit activity or person in conflict with law. So finally we end up depending on NCRB data, which is nothing but tip of the iceberg, because it doesn't reflect what is it. Only those who are in the police record. And so many times we see the complicity of police, pimp, and local politicians also, as you saw in the TISS study of shelter homes. No, so that makes it very difficult. So now I think best thing is that even at a Panchayati Raj institution, if we can sensitize Panchayati Raj institution, because all the villages and all the local self-government bodies, they maintain record of birth, death, sex ratio, literacy, various kind of physical and social infrastructure facilities. Along with that, which are if they start maintaining record, No, then it, and NGOs have also done it at a micro level. They are maintaining record. Same thing if we can say if we include training on visibility of trafficking in statistics and indicators to the Panchayati Raj institution, and especially we have 18 states where 50% elected representatives are women. So I think gender sensitization and giving them proper understanding of the defined definition of work and incoming place, and format can be made. We can come up with a format and can share it with the Panchayati Raj institution. So I think Ministry of Panchayati Raj institution would be the best to first as an entry point to get the data, because from micro level we'll get, and then connect them with the local urban local self-government bodies and peri-urban tier 2 tier 3 cities. That kind of connectivity is possible, and we have seen in last 4 months of lockdown also, when it came to gender-based violence, how the women's organization reached out to all these existing governance structures which are there in the Panchayati Raj institutions to address the issue of violence.
How we would really hope that this would actually be more like a government initiative to make sure it was all collected in one place, instead of NGOs having to hunt for them, right? Find our right organizations. That's the only lacuna out here, you know. So, like we see, West Bengal among all the states actually accounts for 44% of India's trafficking victims, but NCRB reports don't really reflect that. In fact, yesterday when we were trying to see which is the state which has the highest rates, we saw there was nothing said against West Bengal, and Rajasthan showed the highest. I mean, we are seeing an increase in Rajasthan, but West Bengal itself, there's no data on West Bengal, which is so sad. And 24th Pargana South is actually the most vulnerable state, and that's where all the girls come to, from GB Road and Kamathipura is full of girls from Sundarbans. So the trust has actually been really working on prevention of trafficking there through empowering all the young vulnerable women and girls in the Sundarbans. And we have now set up 2 livelihood centers and skill training centers, because to prevent trafficking by economic empowerment. So many of our survivors have been, we counsel them and we rigorously work with them to get them into our livelihood centers. But we always face that though the other vulnerable community, the child marriage victim or the other domestic violence victim or the alcohol abuse victims, they come in faster. It's the survivors who take the longest to come into our fold. And there's a real struggle with the girls who've come back home after, after they've done the whole route of rescue, being in, and now they've come back to their family. Preeti, the question goes to you. How can organizations like ours shape and influence public policy and governmental intervention programs? And how effective can these livelihood programs be in truly empowering them? And does economic empowerment truly help them cross over?
Well, I think when you talk about shaping and influencing public policy, a lot got discussed earlier by people like Anshul, and today, of course, social media is such a great platform. Very well said earlier, things like empowering communities to share their stories. It's so important that, we create those platforms for them to come forward and share their stories. We create a platform where they won't be judged for saying what they want to say. Personal stories definitely play a very, very important role. At least in my life, I've seen a lot of public policies, a lot of laws, when they were getting formulated, people were listening to personal stories, and those personal stories have influenced these policies. The other is data. I just think, evidence and data is lacking in this sector. We really, moving forward, need to build on it, and we need to build on live data. Today, we are still lagging behind. We need to work on it. The other is sharing information, not just sharing stories, but sharing all kinds of information. For all those who are watching this show, we have a website, and, we would love people to consider it as their knowledge partner. It's called www.fighttrafficking.org. Please go visit it. It's for every stakeholder, be it the policymaker, be it a researcher, be it somebody like Anshul. Please visit it and give us suggestions. We're happy to change. We're happy to strengthen it further. Also empowering communities to talk for themselves. Let's create that environment. So on one hand, we spoke about inclusion, but one of the biggest component of inclusion is your right to participate. And very often, I feel we shut our doors, like we've been saying. We don't even let them see the mic, forget about passing the mic. So these are things that we need to do moving forward. Again, I really like to mention on all these forums, please do not go back feeling pessimistic. Okay, it's not that bad, but it's not good, and there is a long journey ahead of us. In terms of livelihood programs, many organizations in India since 2000 have been working very dedicatedly on employability skills, on livelihood programs, and we've seen a shift. So when I started work, do you know what was the rehabilitation and livelihood alternatives given to women? Chalk making, essence stick making. And I never understood how anybody can make a livelihood and sustain themselves. Of course, they can make a livelihood, but to sustain themselves. And since 2000, we saw a big shift there. We saw women's participation. We saw people working on tailor-made livelihood alternatives for individual women. We saw a lot of, the gender bias that existed, that certain kind of skills are meant for women. We saw a shift from that. We saw a lot of livelihood trainings and a lot of economic rehabilitation programs which were market driven. And most important, if the woman or a child was rescued in Bombay and would be restored back to West Bengal, there were organizations also looking at the skill that she was getting in Mumbai. Would that be of use for her if she was to go back to her hometown, her village, or a nearest city close to her hometown? So that was a big shift that we definitely saw. Is it truly empowering women? Yes and no. With some people, with a lot, if there is mentoring, if there is hand holding, if there are linkages established, like Vibhuti was talking, about, making them aware of all the services that exist for them and helping them with, linking them up. There are women who don't even know what are the helplines for them. We need to create that kind of an environment moving forward. Once that is done, I think economic empowerment does have the power for crossover. We can see many more success stories, and we can see that, women will also have the confidence to choose an alternative. Today, I find women don't have the confidence for two reasons: because they are not sure what is being offered to them is economically viable, and for what I had earlier said, whether they would be taken in, whether they will be embraced without stigma, and a society where there would be inclusion, where they won't be judged, where their past will not be dug out all the time, where they won't be answerable because of their past. If we can create that, and wherever this was created, believe me, I have seen success stories. So, and remember, even if we don't see successes, we should always remember economic rehabilitation is the right of a victim. We have to create opportunities for them. We cannot say there was no success, therefore we cannot. Like, when we started in the red light area, people kept saying, but is there a success story with a child of a prostitute? And we kept arguing, Arey Baba, it is the child's right to access education. It is the child's right to stay in a safe environment. I can't give you a success story. I have no narrative because before 1986, nobody had tried. All we are saying is, please ensure people their rights, no matter where they are born, to whom they are born. Rights have to be universal and have to be ensured.
I can feel you. Everything is try the fact that the inclusivity and
Excellent.
I can feel what you're going through, Preeti. I mean, the struggle you're facing to make sure that your children and I mean, everybody under your wing at least has can be in a normal space and not be labeled, you know. I totally get you. So, I mean, there's so much which we've spoken about, and actually, we're way beyond our time. I think conversation was so interesting. I didn't really curb anyone's answers. And actually, I think it's about time to wrap up this amazing conversation. We have lots of quotes in the comments. I think you all should see it because some of them have actually come for you all also. So you all can actually read it and actually answer them directly there also. It'll be good because it'll be a nice engagement which we can even have post this. You know, we don't have to stop here. And I would also like to share with all our viewers that we have a very exciting news to share today on this day. So to celebrate this day, we have actually launched our new website. I would love you all to go visit it. It actually sort of encompasses the achievements the trust has made, and it's a bigger picture of the work we do and an in-depth knowledge on the different initiatives which come under our umbrellas of innovation, education, and empowerment for prevention of trafficking. And it's on www.savemissing.girls.com. No typos, all with double G's and with double S's. So I'd like to bring the webinar to an end. I would like to I think I only have Preeti and Vibhuti left here. Shruti and Anshul, I think you've had to leave. I'd like to thank you both for your time. I know I gave you all very limited time space to talk because each of you can have so much more to say. But this being just an umbrella to talk about the way ahead. So you came from the policy and Preeti, of course, the struggles. And I think Anshul, and I worked with him earlier, and I too believe because of the power of social media and about actually shaping the next generation and how can we change it in a different way instead of the traditional manners, you know, how there is a different way to do it because we've seen it changes happening because of the phone. So much has happened in the digital space. So there's so much we can learn from the younger generation and from amazing platforms like Youth Ki Awaaz. And that's why I'm so thank you guys for everybody for being here today. And let's carry on the conversation on the Facebook Live. And thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you for the
Bye-bye.